Montana Territory, 1878. Dust and golden light fell through the slats of the barn as Grant Oakes pulled his gloves tighter and surveyed the day's work ahead. At 25, he'd already built a respectable cattle operation on the outskirts of Silver Creek, 100 acres with room to grow, just like his dreams. The morning sun caught in his sandy blonde hair as he squinted toward the horizon, his lean frame casting a long shadow across the freshly swept floor. A man needs nothing but his land and his cattle, he muttered to himself, a mantra he'd adopted since his parents' deaths 3 years prior. Attachments only leave you with more to lose. The words rang hollow in the empty barn, but Grant had convinced himself they were gospel truth. The frontier was merciless to those who opened their hearts too wide. He'd seen it firsthand when cholera swept through the territory, taking his parents within days of each other. Since then, he'd poured himself into building something lasting, something that couldn't be snatched away by disease or broken promises. Men around him married and started families, but Grant kept his distance, convinced that independence was the only reliable companion on the frontier. Despite his assertions, loneliness had crept into the corners of his life like the evening chill. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, he imagined a different life, a home with laughter, the warmth of family beyond his solitary existence. But by daylight, he pushed those thoughts aside. A man alone had less to fear from the frontier's harsh realities. A letter had arrived the previous week from his childhood friend Thomas Oberlin, announcing his engagement to Vivian O'Malley, a young woman from back east. Grant had written his congratulations, but privately scoffed at his friend's willingness to risk heartbreak. The frontier was no place for such tender sentiments. On a clear spring morning, as Grant worked the fence line along his eastern boundary, the distant sound of wheels and hoofbeats pulled his attention from his work. A wagon approached, kicking up dust along the rutted road. Curiosity piqued. He secured his hammer and walked to meet the unexpected visitor. The wagon drew closer, revealing a young woman at the reins. Her rose-colored dress was travel-worn, her honey-blonde hair tucked beneath a modest bonnet, though several strands had escaped to frame a face that stopped Grant in his tracks. What caught his attention, however, was the small bundle secured in a sling across her chest. A baby, no more than a few months old. "Excuse me," she called, reining the horses to a stop. Her voice carried a slight Eastern accent, refined but with a hint of determination that suggested she was no stranger to hardship. "I'm looking for the Oakes Ranch. Would you be Grant Oakes?" Grant nodded, suddenly conscious of the dirt on his hands and face. "That's me." The woman's deep blue eyes studied him carefully. She couldn't have been more than 22, yet there was a maturity in her gaze that belied her years. "My name is Vivian O'Malley," she said, adjusting the infant who had begun to stir. "I believe you're acquainted with my sister Violet." Grant's brow furrowed. "Thomas's fiancée?" A shadow crossed Vivian's face. "Yes, or she was. Violet passed away 3 months ago from scarlet fever." The news hit Grant like a physical blow. Thomas had been his closest friend since boyhood, despite their different paths. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss O'Malley, but I don't understand why you've come all this way." Vivian took a deep breath. "Thomas was meant to meet me in Denver, but he never arrived. I received word that he'd been thrown from his horse near Silver Creek." Her voice wavered slightly. "The letter said he spoke of you before he died, that you'd promised to care for Violet if anything happened to him." Grant's mind reeled. Thomas dead? And what promise? They'd shared whiskey one night, months ago, when Thomas had first announced his plans to marry. Grant had made some offhand comment about watching over Thomas's bride if the worst happened, the kind of empty assurance men made over drinks. "Miss O'Malley, I think there's been some misunderstanding." The baby chose that moment to let out a plaintive cry. Vivian gently bounced the child, revealing a face with Thomas's unmistakable features. "This is Eliza," Vivian said softly. "Thomas's daughter. Violet was with child when they became engaged. He was coming to bring them west, to build a life here." Grant stared at the infant, whose cries quieted as she gazed up at him with eyes that mirrored her father's. In that moment, his carefully constructed beliefs about remaining unattached collided with the reality before him. A young woman and an orphan child with nowhere to turn. "You'd better come inside," he said finally, reaching to help her down from the wagon. "We have much to discuss." The small cabin Grant called home had never felt so inadequate as when Vivian stepped inside, the baby cradled against her chest. He hastily cleared the table of breakfast dishes, hyper-aware of how unprepared he was for visitors, especially female ones. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it's warm and dry." Vivian's gaze took in the sparse furnishings, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a modest cook stove, a narrow bed in the corner with a wool blanket. A few books lined a rough-hewn shelf, the only hint of sentimentality in the utilitarian space. "It's more than we had in the hotel in Denver after our money ran out," she replied, settling into the chair he offered. Over coffee, Vivian shared her story. After Violet's death, she discovered her sister's correspondence with Thomas, including his intention to marry and his promise that his friend Grant would ensure they'd want for nothing if tragedy struck. With no family remaining in Boston after their parents' deaths, Vivian had used the last of their savings to bring Eliza west. "I understand if you feel no obligation," she said, her composure remarkable despite the desperation of her situation. "But I had nowhere else to turn." Grant ran a hand through his hair, conflicted. His ranch was barely profitable, his days long and solitary by design. A woman and child would upend everything. "You can stay until we figure something out," he found himself saying. "There's a widow in town who might take you in, or perhaps the minister's family." Relief washed over Vivian's face. "Thank you, Mr. Oakes. We won't be a burden. I can cook and keep house while we're here." That night, Grant gave Vivian his bed and fashioned a makeshift crib for Eliza from a wooden crate padded with blankets. He slept on a pallet by the stove, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of breathing that wasn't his own filling the cabin. In the morning, he woke to the smell of coffee and biscuits. Vivian stood at the stove, Eliza secured to her back with a length of cloth. She'd somehow transformed his meager supplies into a proper breakfast, the table set with his mismatched dishes arranged neatly. "I hope you don't mind," she said, noticing him watching her. "I thought you might appreciate a hot meal before your work." Grant couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him. "Smells better than anything I've managed," he admitted, sitting down to a plate of food that tasted of home and care, things he'd convinced himself he didn't need. Days passed, falling into an unexpected rhythm. Grant would leave at dawn for his work with the cattle, returning to find the cabin transformed bit by bit. Vivian had discovered an old trunk of his mother's linens, freshening the space with clean curtains. She'd planted a small kitchen garden using seeds she'd carried from Boston, and repaired clothing he'd set aside as too damaged to bother with. A week into their arrangement, a spring storm trapped them indoors for 2 days. Grant found himself learning to hold Eliza, awkward at first, but gradually more confident as Vivian showed him how to support the baby's head and rock her to sleep. "You're a natural," Vivian observed as Eliza dozed in his arms, her tiny hand curled around his finger. "Never thought I'd have cause to hold a baby," Grant replied, surprising himself with the twinge of regret in his voice. "Why not? Most men your age are starting families." Grant hesitated, then shared the story of his parents' deaths, how quickly illness had taken them despite their strength and youth. "I learned that loving someone means giving fate a target," he said. "The frontier takes what it wants, when it wants. Better to stand alone than to lose what matters." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. "My parents died in a fire when I was 16 and Violet 14, she finally said. "We lost everything except each other. But I never regretted having them, loving them, even knowing how it would end." She met his eyes steadily. "The years we had were worth the pain that followed." Her words lingered with Grant as he rode the fence line the next day, checking for damage after the storm. For years, he'd built his life around avoiding attachment, convinced it was the only way to survive the frontier's harsh realities. But watching Vivian with Eliza, seeing the fierce love that sustained them through loss and uncertainty, had planted a seed of doubt in his carefully constructed worldview. The second week brought unexpected visitors: Harriet Wheeler, the town gossip, accompanied by Reverend Miller and his wife. They'd heard about the young woman and baby staying at Grant's ranch and had come to assess the propriety of the situation, as Mrs. Wheeler put it with thinly veiled disapproval. Grant bristled at the implication, but Vivian handled the visitors with graceful diplomacy, explaining their connection through Thomas and her temporary situation until more suitable arrangements could be made. "Of course, the child should be raised in a proper home," Mrs. Wheeler said pointedly. Perhaps you should consider placing her with a family, dear. A single woman has few prospects for marriage with another man's child in tow. Grant saw the flash of hurt in Vivian's eyes before she composed herself. Eliza is all the family I have left in this world, she replied evenly. I could no more part with her than I could stop breathing. After the visitors departed, promising to keep an eye on the situation, Grant found Vivian in the garden, tears silently tracking down her cheeks as she worked the soil with more force than necessary. Don't mind Mrs. Wheeler, he said awkwardly. She's been stirring trouble since the town was founded. It's not that, Vivian replied, wiping her face with the back of her hand. It's knowing they're right about my prospects. Eliza deserves better than a life of uncertainty. Grant knelt beside her, surprising himself by taking her soil-covered hands in his. You're giving her everything that matters. Love, safety, sacrifice. I've seen how you are with her. Thomas would be proud. The moment stretched between them, something unspoken passing in the connection of their hands. Grant felt a wall within himself crack, just slightly, as Vivian's gaze held his. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eliza sleeping peacefully in her makeshift cradle, Grant made a decision. Stay, he said suddenly. Not just temporarily. Make your home here. Vivian looked at him, startled. What are you saying? The cabin needs work, another room at least. But there's land here, good land. Room for a proper garden, maybe fruit trees. Eliza could grow up with space to run. The words tumbled out, revealing thoughts he hadn't fully acknowledged even to himself. I promised Thomas I'd look after his bride if needed. I can at least offer his child and her aunt a home. As what, Mr. Oakes? Your housekeepers? There was no bitterness in her question, only a need for clarity. Grant hesitated. As family, he said finally. Whatever that means to us. Vivian considered his offer, her expression thoughtful. I accept, on one condition. That we are partners in this arrangement, not charity cases. I want to contribute to building whatever this becomes. They shook hands like business associates, though both felt the significance of the moment extend far beyond a mere arrangement of convenience. As spring melted into summer, Grant added a second room to the cabin, while Vivian expanded the garden and took charge of the chickens he'd neglected. They fell into a partnership neither had anticipated. She handled the accounts with a head for figures that impressed him, while he taught her to ride and shoot with a proficiency that would serve her well on the frontier. Their days developed a comfortable rhythm, but their evenings revealed a deepening connection. After Eliza was asleep, they would sit by lamplight, Vivian mending or reading aloud from one of Grant's books while he whittled or cleaned his tools. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams they'd once held. Did you ever think of marrying? Vivian asked one evening as thunder rumbled in the distance. Before you decided attachment was too dangerous? Grant's hands stilled on the bridle he was repairing. Once. There was a girl in town when I was 20, Sarah Milligan. We courted for a summer before her family moved on to Oregon. He gave a rueful smile. When she left, it reinforced what I already suspected, that people don't stay, not out here. And now, Vivian's question hung in the air between them. Before he could answer, a pounding at the door startled them both. Grant opened it to find his neighbor Jacob Thornton, soaked from the brewing storm. Rustlers hit the Anderson place, Jacob said without preamble. They're gathering men to track them before the rain washes out the trail. Grant grabbed his gun belt, turning to Vivian. Lock the door behind me. I'll be back when we've found them. Fear flashed across her face, but she nodded. Be careful. The posse rode out in the pelting rain, following tracks that led toward the mountains. For 3 days, they pursued the rustlers, finally cornering them in a rocky canyon. The ensuing gunfight left 2 of the thieves dead and one of the posse wounded, but they recovered most of the stolen cattle. When Grant returned home, mud-caked and exhausted, he found the cabin dark save for a single lamp in the window. Inside, Vivian sat in a chair she'd pulled near the door, Eliza asleep in her arms. The relief that washed over her face at the sight of him stirred something profound in his chest. I was afraid you wouldn't come back, she whispered, rising to help him with his wet coat. I promised I would, he replied, suddenly understanding how much that promise meant to both of them. As summer ripened into harvest season, their routine solidified into something that felt remarkably like a family. Grant found himself watching Vivian in unguarded moments. The way sunlight caught her hair as she hung laundry, how she hummed to Eliza while kneading bread, the determination in her posture as she learned to milk the cow he'd purchased. In town, they were the subject of speculation. Grant overheard whispers about the arrangement at the Oaks Ranch, some kindly, others less so. The rumors reached a peak when Mrs. Wheeler confronted them outside the general store. "Mr. Oaks, while your charity toward the young woman is commendable, people are beginning to talk," she said, her voice carrying just enough for nearby shoppers to hear. A man and woman living together unmarried, with a child no less. It sets a poor example. Grant felt Vivian stiffen beside him. Before he could respond, Sheriff Daniels approached, his expression friendly but firm. "Mrs. Wheeler, I believe your husband is looking for you at the feed store," he said, effectively dismissing her before turning to Grant and Vivian. "Don't pay her any mind. Most folks understand your situation." But the encounter left its mark. On the ride home, Vivian was uncharacteristically quiet, her face pensive as she held Eliza. "Perhaps Mrs. Wheeler is right," she said finally. "Not about propriety, but about clarity. We've built something here, Grant, something good. But we exist in this undefined space. Not quite family, not merely friends." Grant guided the wagon off the main road, stopping beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. He turned to face her directly. "What are you saying, Vivian?" "I'm saying that I care for you," she answered, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "More than I expected to, more than makes sense given our circumstances. But I need to know if this, us, has a future beyond convenience and obligation." The question forced Grant to confront feelings he'd been avoiding for weeks. His carefully constructed defenses against attachment had crumbled in the face of daily life with Vivian and Eliza. The easy laughter, shared work, and quiet moments that had become essential to his happiness. "I've been fighting it," he admitted. "The idea that I could want a family again, that I could risk that kind of loss. But watching you with Eliza, seeing how you face each day with courage despite everything you've lost." He took her hand. "You've made me question everything I thought I knew about surviving on the frontier." Hope flickered in Vivian's eyes, but she waited for him to continue. "I don't want you to stay out of obligation or convenience," he said. "I want you to stay because this is where you belong, with me, building something together that's stronger than our fears." It wasn't quite a declaration of love, not yet, but it was a step toward possibility that neither had dared hope for weeks before. That night, Grant moved his bedroll back to the main room, conscious of the shifting nature of their relationship. Something had changed, but both recognized the need for care and time. As autumn painted the landscape in gold and crimson, Grant received a letter that upended their newfound equilibrium. Thomas's brother Edward had tracked down Vivian's whereabouts and was coming to claim guardianship of Eliza, asserting his rights as the child's only blood relation. "He can't take her," Vivian said, her face pale as she read the letter. "Eliza doesn't know him. I'm the only mother she's ever had." Grant read over the formal language, the legal assertions, and felt a cold dread. "He'll be here in 2 weeks. We need to see Judge Harmon before then." The judge's news wasn't encouraging. Without a formal adoption or guardianship arrangement, Vivian had no legal claim to Eliza beyond having cared for her these past months. Blood relations, especially male ones with financial means, were typically favored by the courts. "There is one solution," Judge Harmon said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "If you were to marry Mr. Oaks and adopt the child together, you'd present a more compelling case. A stable home with 2 parents rather than a single woman of limited means." The suggestion hung in the air between them as they rode home in silence. It was Vivian who finally addressed it as they sat before the fire that evening. "A marriage of convenience," she said quietly. "To keep Eliza." Grant watched the firelight play across her features. "Is that what it would be? Convenient?" Their eyes met, and the pretense fell away. "No," she admitted. "Not for me." "Nor for me," he replied, moving to kneel before her chair. "I've been fighting against needing anyone since my parents died. Then you arrived with Eliza, and suddenly my quiet life feels empty without your voices filling it." He took her hands in his. "I don't want to marry you to keep Edward from taking Eliza, though I'd do that in a heartbeat. I want to marry you because I love you, Vivian O'Malley." Tears spilled down Vivian's cheeks as she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I love you too. I think I have since that first week, when you held Eliza in your arms and looked so terrified and yet so determined to do it right. Their wedding was a simple affair at Reverend Miller's church, with Sheriff Daniels and his wife as witnesses. Judge Harmon filed the adoption papers immediately after, establishing Grant and Vivian Oakes as Eliza's legal parents. When Edward Oberlin arrived the following week, he found not a vulnerable young woman he could intimidate, but a legally established family prepared to fight for their daughter. After a tense meeting and a review of the adoption documents, Edward reluctantly withdrew his claim, though not without bitterness. Thomas would have wanted his daughter raised by family, he said as he prepared to leave. She is being raised by family, Grant replied firmly, his arm around Vivian's waist as she held Eliza. The family that loves her. As winter settled over the ranch, Grant added a proper nursery to the growing cabin. Their evenings now ended with Grant and Vivian in their shared bedroom, the initial awkwardness giving way to a deep intimacy neither had expected to find on the frontier. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside, they sat before the fire with Eliza, now crawling and babbling, between them on a quilt. I have something for you, Grant said, handing Vivian a small wooden box. Inside was a gold locket containing miniature portraits of Thomas and Violet that he'd commissioned from a traveling artist using photographs Vivian had brought west. For Eliza, he explained as Vivian's eyes filled with tears, so she'll know where she came from, even as she grows with us. Vivian clasped the locket around their daughter's neck, the small heart resting against her chest. And I have something for you, she said, taking Grant's hand and placing it gently on her stomach. Come summer, our family will grow again. Grant's eyes widened, a moment of his old fear flashing across his face before being replaced by wonder and joy. He gathered Vivian and Eliza into his arms, holding them close as the snow continued to fall, blanketing their ranch, their home, in peaceful white. I was wrong, he whispered against Vivian's hair. All those years believing the frontier was no place for love, that attachments only brought pain. The truth is, love is how we survive out here. It's what makes all the hardship worthwhile. Vivian smiled up at him. It just took the right people to show you. As they sat together in the warmth of their home, the promise of new life growing between them, Grant reflected on how completely his world had changed since that spring day when a woman and baby had arrived on his doorstep. What had begun with an obligation born of a half-remembered promise had transformed into the greatest blessing of his life. A family built on choice and love rather than mere circumstance or blood. Outside, the Montana winter might be harsh and unforgiving, but within the walls of their growing home, they had created something the frontier couldn't take away, a love strong enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead.